You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have our first guest today, and I'm glad, and let me tell you, the West definitely needs God. We do. And so we have Mary Eberstadt, who's written an excellent book here, How the West Really Lost God. Mary, I'm sorry for blowing over our time, and I welcome you to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Anyway, you've taken the time to write this book, and I think you're so right. I think that in your studies with ethics and public policy, you clearly recognize that this country, not just our country, but the West, has lost its way in many ways, and you're here to discuss the different things that are in your book. So please introduce us. One, what made you write this book?
Well, what led me to write it was that I am really interested in the puzzle of secularization. You know, across the Western world for the last several decades now, we've seen dramatic declines in religious practice, professions of religious belief. Western Europe is state-of-the-art this way, but that trend has crossed the Atlantic, and now we see a rising number of 20-somethings in America who profess no religious beliefs. So what's going on here? There has been an explanation for this Western religious decline that's been out there for a while now, really since the Enlightenment, and that explanation goes like this. Religious decline happens because religion is a superstitious bundle of beliefs, and as people get more educated, better off, they realize that they don't need these beliefs anymore, and religion just falls by the way. So, as you know, that's what a lot of sophisticated people believe, and essentially this is an argument that puts religious believers on the wrong side of history. But the reason I wrote the book is that if you look at this more closely, that explanation, which is the going explanation, does not hold up for a variety of reasons. First of all, let's take the stereotype of the religious believer. You remember it was 10 years ago that the Washington Post infamously caricatured evangelicals as being uneducated and easy to command. Do you remember that quote? That's a stereotype. The idea that religious believers are congregated at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder is wrong. In fact, statistics show the opposite, and I use the numbers from a lot of perfectly secular social scientists in the book. As you go up the socioeconomic ladder in America, you find people more likely to profess belief in God and to go to church than if you are at the bottom of that ladder. Now, that's a really interesting point, because what that means is that prosperity alone and education alone do not drive out God. So one thing I'm trying to do in the book is get rid of that old stereotype and point out that the going theory about secularization is seriously flawed for several reasons. That's just one of them. So if that's not going on, what is? That's the big question. And what I argue is that if you look at the periods in history where Christianity has been strong, if you look at Victorian England, for example, or if you look at the United States and the countries of Western Europe right after World War II, going into the 1960s, what you see is that vibrant churches mean vibrant families. And periods of family decline are periods of religious decline. There's no such thing as religious decline that happens in a vacuum without family decline too. So this is a new way of looking at the phenomenon of secularization, and I think in a funny way it's a more optimistic way of looking at it too, because instead of being stuck with the narrative that says, look, your religious decline is inevitable, I think people can now look at what the mechanisms are that make religion come and go in the world. So I hope that's a modest contribution.
No, it is. And you brought up another thing here that regarding family, and I think that you're so spot on with this, and I think family is very closely tied with religious beliefs, because if you don't have family, you tend to not have that support system anyway. But I think when a family doesn't have religion, they don't have that sense of closeness with one another, and I think families break down over time and generations.
Well, it is statistically a certainty that if you are single, you're less likely to go to church or synagogue than if you are married. And if you're married with children, you are even more likely to go to regular religious services than if you're just married. So what is it about having children and marriages that drives people to church? That's part of what I look at in the book, because I think it's a really important question that's been overlooked by conventional sociology, conventional ways of looking at these things. So what I argue is that there are things about just living in families that make people more inclined toward church and religion. So, for instance, start with a very basic fact. The birth of a child for many mothers and fathers is a sort of transcendental cosmic event. Most mothers and fathers will say that's the most important thing they've ever done. And if you've not had that experience that so takes you out of yourself, you might not be as inclined to think that you have a place in the cosmos and that there is a creator designer who is looking over you. But the parents of the world very often experience their children as created by something or someone. And there we have an example of an opening toward religion that people who are not in that situation wouldn't have. And that's just one of the examples I give in the book. But I think it's an especially powerful example because I think it's a very common experience, and it's part of what's going on in the statistics that show having children makes people go to church.
That's right. Now, Mary, how are rising rates of divorce and single parenthood, legal abortion, the widespread use of contraception, and a sharp drop in the Western birth rate related to the decline of religion?
Well, in very basic ways. I mean, ever since the sexual revolution, people, many millions of Western people, have lived in open or tacit defiance of the Christian moral code. You know, the Judeo-Christian moral code, the traditional moral code, is a very strict thing. And as of the sexual revolution, a lot of people decided that they wanted to throw it overboard. So, people living like that are not people you expect to find in church, at least not in traditional churches. So that's one sort of obvious thing that's going on. Another thing is that Christianity is very hard to disentangle from the family itself. This is a religion that starts with the birth of a baby. It's a religion that's about a holy family. And in all kinds of ways, if you don't understand the family, you're not going to understand this religion as well as other people. So, for instance, if you are growing up with a single mom, say, and you've never had a dad in your life, you might have more of a reach to figure out this concept of God as an all-loving, benevolent father figure, right? Because if you don't know what that kind of figure is like, you're going to have a harder time understanding that very basic part of the Christian story. So there are other ways I talk about in the book where I think the changes in family formation put unintentional but very real obstacles in the way of people going to church or returning to church.
Mary, this is John. I have a very common discussion thread that I have with friends who are either agnostic or atheist about the fact that religion is important even if you don't believe in it. And these are many people who have a very strong belief system that they may believe everything in the Constitution or the Ten Commandments, but they do so without believing it comes from the hand of God. So the question for you is, what should these secular-minded folks be concerned about with the collapse of faith in the family structure, irrespective of their personal belief system?
Well, the answer is lots. They need to be concerned about lots of things, and that's why I say in the book this is an argument for secularists and atheists as well as for believers, because society depends on believers doing what they do. Society depends, first of all, on strong families wherever it can find them, because the welfare state is largely a creation of the fractured Western family. It's the family substitute that has developed for the fact that many homes don't have dads, don't have extended family, don't have the kind of backup that they used to have. So enter the welfare state, which is also a pretty critical player in this. But another reason why people need to be concerned is that religious believers in the United States have been carefully studied by some pretty secular people, and they give back in the public square in a way that they don't get credit for. I'll give you an example. They're far more likely to contribute to charity, private charity. So if you look over to Western Europe, for instance, where countries are much more secular, you see very little charitable giving. In the United States, most of it is being done by people who are Christian because they have a creed that tells them to take care of the sick and the weak and the poor, and they are more likely to act on that. So that's one way that they give back. They are also far more likely to volunteer their time to various causes. They're even more likely to give blood than secular people. And I'm not saying this to knock the secular people. I'm just observing that in all kinds of ways, believers are contributing to society out of proportion to their numbers. So those are two pretty big reasons why everybody ought to be concerned about what's going on with religion in the public square and with attempts that we see now to marginalize Christians, call them extremists, and otherwise try to diminish their influence. Yeah, I think that's a short-sighted mistake for the secularists and the atheists as well as for the believers.
Now, Mary, while I understand there's been an unhealthy alliance historically, especially if you go back 100 or more years ago around the world with religion and government when they came into direct alignment, but we have protections against that. With that said, it really troubles me that the government has, for the most part, replaced family as our personal and social support systems. George Bush Sr., in his 1,000 Points of Light speech, really focused on the church as a better alternative. And by church, churches, temples, even mosques, as a much better alternative. Can you speak to the economic situation we're in now seems ripe for that type of transition?
Well, in a funny way, I think what's going on could end up being the seeds of a religious and a family revival. And what I mean by that is, the welfare state that is supposed to be a family substitute and that promises cradle-to-grave care. You remember that Julia video during the re-election campaign about the cartoon character who was taken care of by the state from daycare all the way to the end of her life? Remember that?
Yes, we're still scarred.
Yes, well, that is the promise of the modern welfare state. But if you read the financial pages of the papers these days and you watch what's going on in Greece and in Spain, and just as a general observer, you don't have to be an expert, you can see why a lot of people think that the days of the modern welfare state are numbered. I mean, demographically, there aren't enough taxpayers to go around as it is. And you see situations like 30% unemployment in Greece, and you see riots in the streets over austerity measures. Arguably, what we are witnessing is, if not the implosion of the welfare state, at least the beginnings of a radical reinterpretation of it and a reining in of it that will come of all this financial chaos. So if that were to happen and people were to realize that you can't actually rely on the state to do the Julia thing, then I think what would end up is people would do what they always do in times of adversity. They would look closer to home. They would look closer to their families, their churches. The point is that hard times have a way of driving people back to these elemental connections, and that's another place where church comes from, is the desire to understand adversity and hardship. And we saw this after 9/11. Do you remember that the churches were packed? The synagogues were packed after 9/11. People who had not been in them in decades were suddenly wanting to go and be part of a religious community, even if only for a little while. So the bottom line is that I think the arguable implosion of the welfare state will end up reinvigorating the family and the churches.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. When I look at, I know families from years back where it seemed to me, one, there were more members, they were definitely closer, did things together, they attended, as John pointed out, church and synagogue together. And now you have, the next generation where they're not getting married, they're not having children even, they're not even replacing themselves. And I think what makes your book so important and interesting is the fact that if we're not even replacing ourselves and we're not viewing religion as important, or even family and faith as, you describe as being interconnected, how do we maintain not, our way of society in the West going into the future. And so my question to you is really, what are the solutions that you're recommending and offering to help reinvigorate and reawake religion in the West?
Well, first of all, I think pastors, ministers, priests, rabbis have to understand what they're up against here, because I don't think that has been very well understood. They need to understand that these changes in family formation and that the growth of non-traditional households has made it harder for them to get their message across. So they need to figure out more creative ways of doing that. I think also, after the same-sex marriage debates and so much else that has happened in the last few years alone, I think a lot of religious traditionalists feel pretty beleaguered and like they're on the losing side of things. But they need to understand what's in their corner, which is some of the stuff I was just talking about. They need to, I think, play a little more offense and a little less defense with things like, hey, don't knock us. We're the ones giving to charities. We're the ones, supporting the volunteer sports program after school. Let's live and let live a little more. So I think those folks could be more proactive as well. But in general, it's time to set the record straight on this prevailing narrative that's been handed down at least since Friedrich Nietzsche announced the death of God. The idea has been that God is dying, God will die, and it's all because we are getting so sophisticated and smart about things. The record does not support that interpretation. So the first thing to understand is that inevitability is not what the record shows. The record shows something much more interesting, which is that religion can come and go in the world, and I think that's a much more optimistic note, at least for the believers out there.
Well, that's good to hear, and I commend you on a very nice book, something that we should definitely be discussing more. I think it's to the benefit of this generation and future generations. So I want to thank you for writing this, but I also want to thank you for joining us today. And I didn't say this, but you are a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And I want to thank you. And where could people find a copy of your book, and where could people follow you?
Thank you. They can find it on the website, howthewestlreallylostgod.com. It's available there, and you can have a free chapter, I think. Same title as the book, howthewestlreallylostgod.com. And, of course, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc.
Excellent. Well, Mary Eberstadt, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you great success with this book and future endeavors as well.
Thank you, guys. Thanks very much for having me.
All right. Take care.